Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Kriti Mehta and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Now, as 2026 begins, the Middle East remains caught in a state of fragile stability and deep uncertainty. Unresolved wars in Gaza, Yemen and Syria continue to devastate millions, while nationwide protests in Iran, regional power shifts and US military interventions have further complicated an already volatile landscape. From humanitarian collapse and mass displacement to ideological divides and broken governance, the region is struggling to escape cycles of violence, raising questions about whether real political solutions are finally possible or whether instability has become permanent. To discuss this, joining us now is Elisabeth Kendall, who is a British Arabist, academic, commentator and mistress of Girton College from Cambridge. She is widely recognized for her work on the Middle East and on how Islamist extremist groups exploit Arabic culture, literature and traditions. Thank you for joining us, Elisabeth. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start with my first question. As the year has set in 2026, the Middle East still remains in a state of enforced equilibrium with unresolved wars in countries like Yemen, Syria, then in Gaza. Protests are also in Iran and shifting alliances across the region. Yet no durable resolution inside, with overlapping crises now defining the Middle East. Would you say the region is trapped in permanent instability, or could 2026 finally deliver real political solutions to replace cycles of violence?
Well, from where we're sitting right now, it looks like instability is in a semi-permanent kind of state. I can see that, but I think that would be an overstatement. On the other hand, I think it's very unlikely that 2026 will see real political solutions, because the reality is that no matter what the US president says in terms of solving peace for 7 or 8 wars since he came into power a year ago, in reality, the path to peace is a long one. And the fact is that 2 years now since the Hamas attacks on Israel, the region is in turmoil. And I think all of those countries that you've just mentioned are still in a state of flux, and certainly not on the way to a long-term peace. Gaza, for example, although we've moved to phase 2 now of the peace plan, in fact, the reality is that phase 1 hasn't really been completed. There's no real ceasefire. And in Syria, despite a ceasefire being signed just a couple of days ago with the Kurds, that's already looking like it's faltering. In Yemen, the Houthis are still strong on the ground despite over 7 weeks of war with the United States last year. And in Iran, thousands have been brutally gunned down for standing up to their theocratic regime, and that's still in power. So I guess the short answer is it's not the case that tactical military actions really lead to long-term strategic outcomes such as peace without a long, hard road.
Sure. Elisabeth, now since late December last year, nationwide protests in Iran have spread to all 31 provinces, and human rights groups have put the death toll above 5,000 and arrests well over 18,000. Now, while the regime has cracked down brutally on protesters under an internet blackout that was enforced, how do you interpret the convergence of economic decline, political protest and regime repression in Iran, and does this signify the start of a real internal change or merely deeper authoritarian entrenchment?
Well, it could be a bit of both. Certainly, it's a lethal cocktail that you mentioned: economic decline coupled with political protest and repression. that could act as a catalyst for internal change, by which I mean things like economic reform. And Iran's rulers certainly expressed some sympathy with economic grievances that were at the root of the start of these protests when traders in markets came out to protest the poor standard of living. The problem was that once the criticism turned to the regime itself, those in theocratic power, the protests were not tolerated. So I see, on the one hand, an understanding that some internal changes need to happen, but at the same time, an entrenchment of the theocratic rule itself. And I don't think that's necessarily contradictory. We saw just 3 years ago with the Women, Life and Freedom protests in 2022 that there was some internal change, such as loosening of the rules on wearing the headscarf, but that the regime itself entrenched. So it's very hard to see anything happening to uproot that regime unless there's significant external force, for example, by the US, or an internal turning on the regime by an entity like the IRGC. But remember that the I in IRGC stands for Islamic, Islamic and not Iranian, and so it would be very hard to see that kind of turn.
Sure. Let's talk about Yemen now, Elizabeth. Its civil war has swung into fresh combat, including the 2025 to 26 Southern Yemen campaign, where major factions fought over Aden and control of the south. Then roughly 21.6 million people still need humanitarian aid, and children are among the hardest hit. With Yemen's war now layered with shifting alliances and persistent humanitarian collapse, is Yemen a proxy battleground now, in your opinion, or a failed state that could break the cycle?
I would say that it's close to being a failed state, but a better description would be of a proxy battleground, because we have three major regional powers who are backing three distinct internal factions. We have Iran backing the Houthis, who are based in Sana'a. We have Saudi Arabia backing the Presidential Leadership Council, the government. That's the internationally recognized government. And then we have the United Arab Emirates backing a group called the Southern Transitional Council. These are southern separatists who were formerly part of the government. Now, the previous conflict was between these latter two groups, the internationally recognized government and the separatists, who were aligned together against the Houthis. But the most recent conflict is now between the Saudi-backed groups and the UAE-backed groups. So you can see why it's beginning to look like even more of a proxy battleground than it was before. That said, there are glimmers of hope. Saudi Arabia is currently leading a dialogue on the south, on the separatist agenda, so it might be that many of the southerners can be brought into the main government camp. That would certainly simplify things. And if successful, then that could lead to a single, united, internationally recognized government that could lead the diplomatic and military action against the Iran-backed Houthis. So it might still end well in Yemen.
All right, sure. Now, Elizabeth, in 2025, about 1.2 million refugees had returned to Syria, but over 7 million remain internally displaced. And ongoing violence, including sectarian tensions, still threatens fragile stability. Now, given millions have been displaced, extreme poverty is among Syrians, and renewed sectarian tensions, what does the future Syrian state really look like? Can it ever heal, or is fragmentation, in your opinion, now more or less permanent?
I don't think we need to see fragmentation as permanent. Certainly, it's a very complex tapestry in Syria. We have the Kurds, the Alawites, the Druze, jihadi groups, amongst others. And it's not helped by outside actors who foment tensions between these groups. But I believe healing is possible. And we've certainly seen Syrian communities coexisting peacefully in the past. So the hope is that they can do so again. And remember, however bad it looks right now, it was worse under Bashar al-Assad. And I think there's hope because there is concerted international support for a single leader, the president, the leader, Ahmed al-Shara, and the US is behind him too. Sanctions are being eased. He's going to be in Davos, meeting world leaders. There's a sporting chance that he might be able to pull it together. And we have seen a ceasefire in the last couple of days between the Syrian state and the Kurdish-led factions. So although that looks to be faltering a little at the moment, it's a positive sign. So I think there's everything to play for in Syria still.
Sure. Talking now about Israel, it's poised for elections this year against the backdrop of years of conflict with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the recent wars involving Iran, with analysts predicting now continued dominance by right-wing parties and little change in the core policy. Now, at a moment when national security is overshadowing domestic policy, are the 2026 Israeli elections more about existential threats than political choice? And what does that really mean then for peace prospects with Palestinians?
It's certainly true that many Israelis have a keen sense of existential threat from the outside right now, albeit Iran and its axis of resistance have been hugely degraded over the past 2 years. And at this point, it's also worth noting that there are many Israelis who also feel skepticism and distrust of Israel's own internal electoral processes. So I think that the short version of this is to say that political opinion is highly fragmented in Israel. And what does that mean for peace prospects with the Palestinians? Well, if Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party falls short of a governing majority in the upcoming elections, even together with the right-wing and religious partnerships that his party has had, and that, by the way, is a real possibility, then I think many would see two likely outcomes. One is a period of political deadlock, and that would certainly hamper the ability to drive peace with the Palestinians. But the second is it could act as a catalyst for a unity government. And that seems to speak to a greater chance of peace. But either way, I think the real game changer here is not going to be the Israeli elections at all. It's going to be President Donald Trump's attitude and his vision for Israel, because, of course, the US has an ability not only to influence Israel directly, but also to influence peace outcomes through its newly appointed Board of Peace.
Sure. Now, across Libya, Sudan, Gaza, Yemen, and Syria, entire generations are growing up amid displacement, poverty, and the collapse of trust in state institutions. Is the region's enduring instability rooted in sectarian and ideological divides, or is it fundamentally one of the broken governance and economic despair?
It's difficult to disentangle those elements, but I would say that it's fundamentally a question of instability being rooted in broken governance, and broken governance leads to economic despair. So, in other words, the root cause is political power and political power seeking, and not religious ideology itself. Often leaders seeking power will latch on to religious ideology as a means to help them achieve their political ends. And of course, outside powers too can stoke tensions to gain influence. We've seen ample examples of that with, for example, what the United Arab Emirates has been doing in channeling support to non-government factions in places like Libya, Sudan, Yemen, and in fact, even in Somalia. And so I guess there are some lessons that we could learn from this in trying to break those cycles of instability and violence. And one of them would be to try to align regional powers behind joint, common, mutual actions. Another would be to focus on building institutions and not supporting strongmen. And also not to neglect youth and education, because this is what's going to be required for countries to build stable futures.
Sure. Elizabeth, now after the US and Israel have struck Iranian nuclear sites in 2025 and the US threatened further action in January, Gulf states have warned that military strikes on Tehran could spiral into full regional conflict. Has US intervention then, in your opinion, helped stabilize the Middle East, or has it instead prolonged conflicts and deepened distrust between the regional powers?
Well, in some areas, it has helped to stabilize the Middle East, and in other areas, it hasn't. Let me give you the major example, I think, of stabilization would be the way in which America has assisted in greatly degrading the threat from Iran. And this isn't just from Iran itself. Of course, the US was game changing in taking part in the strikes in June 2025 on Iranian nuclear capability, but it's also helped to weaken Iran's proxies. So, together with, of course, partners like Israel. So, that would mean weakening Hamas in Gaza, weakening Hezbollah in Lebanon, weakening Shi'i militias in Iraq, and perhaps being instrumental on the sidelines in helping to go with the flow as the Assad regime fell in Syria. Of course, the Houthis in Yemen have been a harder nut to crack, and I wouldn't say that the 7-week or so war that the United States fought with the Houthis helped to stabilize Yemen or the Red Sea region. The Houthis have managed to hold on, and in some ways, you could say that it's even helped to make them stronger, because they have come out of this with a narrative saying that we won against the world's greatest superpower. Look at us. And they also see the defeat of other members of Iran's so-called axis of resistance as an opportunity for themselves. So in that sense, no, not greater stability.
Let's now talk about international media coverage, which often simplifies conflicts and obscures nuance in local perspectives. A problem amplified across social platforms. Does oversimplified Western media coverage make Middle East conflicts harder to resolve by deepening misunderstandings and reinforcing stereotypes?
Yes, it does. Simplified coverage is definitely a big problem. And I think top of my list in thinking about simplification would be the notion of conflating issues, making one element seem equivalent with another. So, for example, often the media, and especially social media, can conflate criticism of Israeli politics with anti-Semitism. They are not the same thing. Or it can conflate Gazans with supporters of Hamas. Of course, again, not the same thing. Gazans haven't voted for Hamas since 2006. That's 20 years ago. And even then, only 44% voted for Hamas. So I would go as far as to say there's probably almost no one alive in Gaza today who actually voted for Hamas. But more dangerous even than simplification is the way in which media polarizes. And again, especially social media. There are no prizes for producing a nuanced, balanced presentation of facts. Followers are won by taking a side and then sticking to that side. And if you want clicks, and of course clicks mean money, then you need to move people's emotions and not their intellects. And actually, I wouldn't say that's even just confined to the media. It's also something that now translates increasingly to diplomacy itself. The danger is that there is simplification of very complex issues that leads to decisions being made on the fly based on very short memos and aimed at transactional outcomes and fast results, as opposed to what would ideally be the case, which would be a steadfast cohort of seasoned professional diplomats with deep historical knowledge and considerable patience, helping to reach sensible decisions.
And one final question before I let you go, Elizabeth. Despite the numerous ceasefires and peace talks, unresolved wars, displacement crisis and ideological battles continue to define the Middle East. What would a genuine Middle East policy look like, let's say in 2030, and who would have to compromise the most to make it a reality?
That's such a difficult question because the Middle East is such a tangle of different conflicts. But my opinion and analysis leads me to think that the root of many of the different conflicts is the Palestinian issue. It has knock-on effects across the region. So if we were to look for increased chances of peace by 2030, it would have to be something to do with solving the Palestinian issue. So many other conflicts are latched onto it. And for that to happen, we need to get to a two-state solution. I think other things need to happen too. I think a GCC, a Gulf Cooperation Council that's truly collaborative, that works together for mutual interest and can make effective decisions that translate into action, that would be very helpful. I think that regional actors focused on long-term outcomes and not short-term wins would be very helpful. And yes, a commitment to building institutions, not backing militant factions. And although maybe democracy is too great a leap in the thrust for peace, I think a recognition that inclusive governance is important and models of indirect democracy are helpful to stability is definitely a prerequisite for peace. And I guess ultimately all countries do act out of self-interest. So really it's about understanding that self-interest is best served by policies which help to achieve stability. And understanding that stability leads to better all-round outcomes, including economic outcomes for everybody for the long term.
All right then, Elisabeth Kendall, thank you for joining me and for sharing your insights on focal length with us at NewsX World.
Thank you for the invitation. You're welcome.
With that, viewers, it's a wrap on this episode of The Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned to NewsX World.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights, to ensure that humanitarian law is respected.
UN Security Council needs a makeover, a comprehensive reform, and India deserves a position there, a role there.
Prime Minister Modi during Operation Sindoor made it amply clear that war has never been India's choice. We are with the side of peace. We are neither neutral nor indifferent. We are with peace.
We would have dealt with US a whole lot on trade and those kinds of things, and that's not as certain these days. So we have to go back and look at our European partners, our Asian partners.
An opportunity to exchange, to have a dialogue, to have a debate, on a different